Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to this episode of All Things Policy. My name is Shobhankita, and for this episode, I'm joined by Tannmay. Tannmay and I are researchers with Takshashila's High-Tech Geopolitics program, and Tannmay, along with Pranay and Narayan at Takshashila, have a paper out, and this is called India Should Double Down on Rare Earth Recycling. But through the paper, they actually have kind of an interesting name for recycling, and they call it urban mining. And we'll get to some details about this from Tanmay in a short while. But I think this is an interesting paper in the sense that since China's use of economic coercion in critical minerals, particularly rare earths, I think much of this has come to the fore geopolitically and globally. And there are different pathways to achieving mineral resiliency, and one of which, of course, is recycling. And this may be an underappreciated facet of the entire mineral value chain. So, Tanmay, my first question to you really is why call this urban mining? Where does this term come from? And like I was saying, we don't necessarily appreciate how useful recycling can be for a country's mineral resiliency goals. So, what can recycling really do?
Right. So I think firstly, the term itself is a very interesting term because although I wish that me, Narayan, and Pranay had coined it, we cannot take that credit. It's an old term. It's interestingly from the 1980s. It was coined by a Japanese professor who, if I'm not wrong, his name is Hideo Nanjio, if I'm pronouncing that right. So, urban mining, he coined the term, and it broadly refers to the process by which you extract waste from already existing materials, right? From already produced goods. For this looks like extracting waste from electronic goods, consumer goods like televisions, or even car batteries or cars themselves, right? So, extracting goods from already manufactured goods that have now reached the end of their life cycle is what we call urban mining. It's a form where the term urban in urban mining comes from the fact that you're trying to go to more urban agglomerations with high waste concentrations with that have precious metals or things you want to use and you can recycle, and you are mining that instead of going to the primary mine or the primary source itself, right? So it's a form of recycling. Coming to the second part of your question about it being an underappreciated form and why it's important to talk about today, I'll just open the discussion here and then we'll definitely go a little back and forth on this. But I think the two most important points that come to mind is that today, a lot of people in the last year have spoken about rare earths and China's dominance because ever since China has started using it as a leverage card, the entirety of the world has started paying attention to it, right? It's become a policy topic, and everybody is talking about rare earths now. But the thing with rare earths is that if you focus on mining and refining exclusively, that is, if you only focus on one part of the value chain, then your reliance on China does not meaningfully reduce, right? For example, if you set up primary mining in India, and if you still have to export that primary mine, your whatever output you get from that primary mine to China for refining, you are still somewhat dependent on China. But this problem exists to a much lesser extent with urban mining because it is a completely circular ecosystem, right? Right from feedstock to mining to refining, because your ore is already refined ore that you're remining. The entirety of the ecosystem can lie within India, and therefore there is no China in any part of the supply chain. But secondly, and I think the more important reason to talk about it today is because it's a relatively low hanging fruit. Primary mining and processing and refining are all very important stages of the value chain that urban mining can never replace. But what it can do is give you a small quick win, right? Because urban mining requires a lot less time to set up. It does not require exploration or licensing or any of the other constraints that come with mining. So the setup time is much lower, and therefore you can actually have something going right away, right? So it is the fastest path to partial self sufficiency, which is as we have argued, right? So I think those are the two main reasons. It's quick and we can get something going, even though it cannot replace primary mining entirely, and it is completely China free in a sense.
Right. So I think just for the benefit of our listeners, the mining stage, the global data on how long it takes to operationalize a mine from first discovery to first production is at least 16 years. And India typically has seen these numbers be larger, even though we don't have conclusive data. I think anecdotally, it just looks like we have longer timelines owing to just difficult processes and environmental clearances, regulatory processes, things like that. And in the processing stage, also, in many of these minerals, China has almost a 90% processing dominance, right? And for the first time in 2018, China actually became a net importer of rare earth materials in the sense that they have decided to outsource mining production outside of their borders, and then they import this initial material, and then they do much of the value added processing, manufacturing, conversion to batteries and magnets, all of that within their borders. So really, both mining and processing are just difficult in terms of timelines, in terms of really removing China from the value chain. And in that sense, I think recycling does emerge as one underappreciated facet, because we have these materials which are anyway end of use, which are anyway being discarded, and streamlining the collection process of all of these final electronic components, wind turbines, electric vehicles, anything that these components might have used rare earths to begin with, uh, they can then be recovered from intelligently and operationalizing some of these things, right?
Absolutely. So I just wanted to add like a couple of points here. So when we talk about mine setup times, and like you said, it takes like 16, 17 years for primary mines to get set up. That is very true. And in fact, the thing is that in India, that problem is further exemplified by the fact that our rarer deposits are co-located with thorium, right? Which creates all sorts of problems when it comes to licensing and when it comes to regulation. So in India, we see that the boot up time for mines is generally even longer. And secondly, when we talk about having end of life products, right? Another very important reason why India in specific should be talking about urban mining is that in fact, are the world's third largest e-waste producers, and this number is only set to grow, right? Our e-waste production is growing at 30% CAGR annually. So entirety of this waste right now is not being utilized, which it can be. So I think that further adds to the point why urban mining is especially important in the Indian context. Sorry, you were saying something.
Thanks for that context. I think I wanted to explore what the different technologies and techniques are for doing urban mining, right? And is there any insight there, particularly as to what India should build on? What is currently the state of India's recycling value chain and ecosystem?
Absolutely. So there are three main methods through which urban mining or recycling can be carried out. The first is hydrometallurgy, and this is the closest method to general mining chemistry, right? In this process, the technicals are that it is first whatever scrap you have, it is mechanically prepared by liberating whatever magnetic material you have. It is scrapped, shredded, crushed, made into a powder-like solution, and then it is leached using an aqueous solution, right? So when you do this, your rare earth ions are separated, and from that separation process, you further precipitate that, and you take and you create your final refined product. So this is hydrometallurgy. The problem with this method is that you have a high amount of water and acid use, and that you need a lot of corrosion resistant equipment, and it is generally more capex heavy, right? Because it's a chemically intensive method. The machinery you need for this is specialized. But crucial to remember here is that this is not a very novel technique. It is the same technique that is used for most of mining, like be it rare earths or be it just general minerals, critical minerals. This is a fairly standard technique that is used across mining. So the knowledge for this is low, like the knowledge barrier is low. It's just that capex to set this up is generally higher. The second route that can be opted for is pyrometallurgy, which is, as you might guess, has to do with fire. It's relatively simpler to understand. It's just that you take the same scrap, you crush it into powder, and you heat it up, right? So you heat it up so that the different elements separate based on their melting point, and then you collect the vapors, condense them, and again you have refined rare earths or whatever you're looking to recycle. Same problems with here. It is very energy intensive, obviously, because you need to run these giant furnaces or smelters, right? And that it can cause, so because of this it is also capex heavy, it is opex heavy as well. Thirdly, what is a new method that is coming up now is thermal electric methods. These are extremely rapid, extremely high temperature pulses. So instead of actually, roasting or burning a metal within a furnace for an extended period of time, in under thermal electric methods you try to shock the material at an extremely high temperature to try to, accelerate that process. This is currently being developed in a form called flash joule heating, the most promising of these experiments, by Rice University. They have a paper on it, which I would recommend all of our listeners to check out. And it is now entering a point where it is commercially viable, right? There are pilots going on in the United States. So I would think that if India is to enter urban mining, it can obviously opt for any of these methods. Hydrometallurgy is the generally opted for method. But checking out or trying new methods like the thermal electric method, which is generally cheaper both on capex and opex, and is more efficient in terms of the percentage of rare earths that you can recover from your feedstock, is something that the firms that are setting up urban mining in the future in India should also look into.
Got it. But what is the challenge, real, in terms of the current ecosystem for recycling in India? What is the current process, and what are the challenges there? What really are the impediments?
So the main impediments in India is firstly, so there's a few, right? There's a few policy impediments and there's a few just structural impediments that have to be fixed with policy, right? I think the most important one here is the informal sector. So in India, there is a deep set kabadiwala network. Whenever you throw away electronic waste, be it a phone or be it a laptop, after passing through a few hands, it will likely end up at a kabadiwala as its final resting place, where the kabadiwala will scrap it for trace amounts of gold or silver or aluminum or other precious metals, right? The problem with this is that since to extract rare earths from feedstock currently is a chemically intensive process and requires specialized machinery, the kabadiwalas ignore it, right? And even if they hypothetically had the machinery to do this, rare earths in itself, within the quantities they are found in laptops and in other feedstock materials, are not as precious and are not as valuable compared to the other materials they could be extracting, like gold or silver. So, because of these reasons, the kabadiwalas or the informal sector generally ignores rare earths. And the problem is that 90% of Indian e waste ends up going to the informal sector, right? As a result of this, it destroys the feedstock. Whatever, even though on paper we have a huge, we have the world's third largest e-waste production year on year, and it's growing. The feedstock is not recovered by people who or by firms that can engage in high value recycling, and it ends up here. And secondly, it is pulling out this e-waste out of the system, and it's only restricted to things that are easy to recover, that use manual processes to recover, right? This is the first problem. There are a few other problems. This is the biggest problem, in my opinion. And a few other problems that come across is that, firstly, with demand, right? The issue is that rare earths, as we all know, have a very volatile price history because China controls the price of rare earths due to their dominance, or 90% dominance. And China has previously been known to engage in dumping, right? What ends up happening whenever a new firm outside China comes up and sets up rare earth production or mining, China engages in dumping, wherein they dump rare earths at a very low, cheap, subsidized price, which is subsidized by the Chinese government. And because of this dumping, the firm that is being set up outside China cannot compete, right? Because the Chinese firm is able to supply these rare earths at a very low price. Because of this, firms that set up outside generally shut down. And because of this dumping, the cycle of dumping and then readjusting to a normal price, rare earths generally face high volatility. So while the price volatility exists, it's irrational for any commercial entity to enter, this sector and try urban mining, because even if they are able to produce refined rare earth concentrate through urban mining, there is no guarantee for at which price they will be able to sell it at, and there is always the risk of China dumping and trying to undercut them. Another thing is with demand. The thing is that in India, there is we as of right now, along with pure rare earths, that is the refined product, we also are highly dependent on China for importing the manufactured goods. So a quick explainer on the rare earth supply chain. It generally operates in three parts, that is mining, refining, and manufacturing, right? So on all three parts, China is the dominant entity. And the thing is that on all three parts, India is heavily import dependent on China. So we do not have any entities within domestically that actually import these refined product from China and then manufacture it into magnets. We instead directly import permanent magnets and whatever rare earth products are from China directly. So the problem with this is that even if an urban mine does set up in India, and even if there is protection from Chinese dumping in forms of tariffs, etc., we still are yet to see domestic demand be set up, in the sense that there are players that are actually demanding rare earths domestically, that incentivizes somebody to do the job of setting up an urban mining and urban mine and provide that refined concentrate for them to use, right? So as long as the demand doesn't come, the supply side of the market is also not going to show up. Yeah.
Yeah. And there must also be an issue of just the capability in being able to absorb these minerals and set up processing and value added manufacturing plants, right? So, for example, magnet production, battery production, any kind of way to absorb these minerals also are industries that, at least in India, are still very nascent.
Correct. Yeah. So, other than this, also, there are smaller challenges that still have to be solved by policy, right? For example, feedstock in itself is a challenge that has to be solved, because, in terms of primary mining, whenever you set up a mine, you have a concentrated ore deposit, right? You have one place from which you are getting a constant supply of ore that you can then mine and refine. But in terms of urban mining, you have a very diverse set of feedstock that you need to actively go out and collect, right? So, in terms of the feedstock as well, it's a much more diverse crowd that you need to collect from. So these are the general challenges that firms face. But other than this, also, there are actually structural policy issues that the government needs to correct for urban mining to be able to exist in India, right? So these are challenges that need to be corrected. These are already existing policies that need to be corrected. And the biggest one of this is the EPR rules, that is the e-waste management rules, right? So under the e-waste management rules, there is a extended producer responsibility framework. It's called the EPR framework. So the purpose of this framework is to mandate producers to recycle their goods, in the sense that recyclers, let's say if I'm an electronics manufacturer and if I make laptops, I have to obtain recycling certificates that show that some percentage of my goods are being recycled, right? And the way for me to do this is to contact a recycler and ask him to do the recycling on my behalf and issue that recycling certificate to me. And this works to some extent. A lot of the big firms that do manufacturing in India have to obtain these EPR certificates to show to the government, and therefore there is a recycling ecosystem for some materials in India. But the problem with the e-waste management rules and the EPR framework is that currently it's restricted only to four metals, right? Gold, copper, aluminum, and iron. In the sense that credits are only issued by ton for these materials, right? So you get certain amounts of credits for recycling 1 ton of gold or 1 ton of iron. But crucially, this four metal framework excludes critical minerals and rare earths, right? So, if there is no incentive for somebody to recycle rare earths, and in fact, if rare earths are more chemically intensive and generally more difficult to refine and recycle than gold or silver, then obviously we're not going to see recycling of rare earths happen even by formal entities, right? Because the formal entity's job is just to do the recycling and give the certificate to the producer. So, if there is no incentive for him to recycle these rare earths, in the sense that it doesn't count towards his credits that he can show the producer, then obviously this is one of the bigger challenges, the policy challenges, as to why there is no rare earth recycling even within formal recyclers, right?
Yeah.
And other than this, there is another thing under the hazardous and other waste rules. So India has actually banned any import of e-wastes, right? So that this was done to prevent India to becoming a dumping ground from just general scrap. But the problem with this is that it cuts off India from a larger feedstock market, right? If any Indian urban mining firm that is already existing or that comes up in the near future is unable to access the global market in terms of feedstock, is unable to import feedstock and end of life products from the global market. The thing is that the numbers show that although India is the world's third largest waste producer, the thing is that we still don't have enough waste to meet our rare earth demands, right? So even if we do recycling properly, we will still need more feedstock. And if we do not reform the fact that we cannot import any feedstock from outside, then our quantities will remain low, and the commercial incentive, on the other hand, also remains low.
Correct. Also, in terms of just how much of this projected demand, or at least current demand, of India's rare earths can be met through urban mining. And I know you've done some calculations and arrived at least at some kind of estimates. And at least prima facie, I think these numbers look compelling. So could you maybe walk us through that, and then we'll close the loop on the other policy recommendations?
Sure, sounds good. So in terms of numbers, our math suggests that as of today, through urban mining, we can produce feedstock of, I mean, we can produce refined concentrate of roughly 1,300 tons of rare earths. And in the coming 10 years or in the coming decade, this number will expand to roughly 6,000 tons. So I'll quickly walk through how we've arrived at this number. So primarily today, the biggest stream of feedstock for urban mining will be hard disk drives, which are slowly going out of service because now everybody is using SSDs, right? So as old computers are trashed and as the hard drives within them are moving to landfills and reaching end of life, this becomes the largest source of feedstock in the present day. And this is enough to supply about 1,200 tons of rare earth oxide currently. And our national demand for rare earths currently is 55,000 tons of rare earths. But crucially, this is rare earths oxide, right? Now, the conversion factor for this is essentially one third. So, for any alloy of rare earths, generally about one third of that is pure rare earth, and two third is other metals that are used as alloys within these compounds, right? So, from that 55,000 ton number, which is how much rare earth products we import in terms of magnets, etc., applying a one third to that, it gives us roughly 17,000. In the sense that we need roughly 17,000 tons of pure rare earth to meet India's national demand, right? So 1,200 tons of this is already satisfied from hard disk drives. And then we have smaller sources like smartphones and other consumer appliances like fridges, TVs. But these don't have that much rare earths in terms of concentration. And therefore, adding all of this up, our current baseline comes to around 1,300 tons, which is roughly 7.5% of the 17,000 number baseline that we've just arrived at. But if we peak this 10, 15 years into the future, the hard disk drive stream will become obsolete because, as I mentioned, people are switching towards SSDs now, which don't have any rare earths in them. So that stream will become obsolete. So we're completely discounting any potential recoverable rare earths from there. But crucially, a very important stream will come into the picture, that is electric vehicles and wind turbines, right? As India moves towards green energy and more renewable forms of energy, and as we set up wind turbines and as more and more people are buying electronic vehicles, this could be in forms of bikes, cars, and even three wheelers, autos. A lot of autos these days are electric autos, right? So as these things reach end of life in the next coming 10 to 15 years, the batteries for electric vehicles and wind turbines have large permanent magnets in them that can become a huge source of rare earths, right? So the numbers on these are that we estimate that given current demand trends and projections, electric vehicles could yield up to 3,000 tons or 3,200 tons of rare earths by 2030, and wind turbines would be looking at somewhere around 2,300 tons. Along with this, the consumer appliances stream, that is smartphones or fridges, TVs, and other appliances will mature. Because the thing is that a lot of the consumer appliances that are within Indian homes today are old, but they are not yet end of life, right? Because India, post liberalization, post 2000s, we saw a huge demand for consumer appliances. And right now, there are a lot of consumer appliances within Indian homes that will only reach end of life in the coming decade. So this stream is also expected to mature and grow. So adding everything up to, again, we reached around 6,000 tons as a figure as to what we can look for 2030. And comparing this to the baseline we set of 17,000 tons, that is around 35%. So that's how we reach the estimate that in the next 10-15 years, around 35% of India's baseline rare earth demand can be met through urban mining alone. And this number can only be increased if we see efficiency gains, which we are likely to see given improvements in technology. And if we reform policy such that if we can import feedstock, then we have more feedstock to work with, and this number will obviously only increase.
Yeah, yeah. And I think in terms of, I mean, the numbers are compelling, but again, to not end up becoming a country that imports pollution uh, and not just the feedstock, I think there may also be a requirement to not just support in terms of capital subsidy for setting up of some of these recycling plants, but also in our international partnerships with, say, the EU, Japan, Korea, etc., to be able to negotiate some kind of technology transfer and investments in clean technology that may help with some of the concerns around the environment here, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, yeah. So that's quite compelling, right? So essentially what we're saying is about 35% of demand, and that's a figure that you've arrived at through some calculations, which I'll leave in the show notes for our listeners to go check out for themselves. But that is in itself quite compelling. And the goal here was never anyway to completely wean off Chinese dependence, right? I mean, if China is able to export cheap, subsidy backed minerals for the benefit of the rest of us, including magnets and other products, then we must use it. But the
Absolutely.
point here is to maybe wean off some of that dependence, just enough for China to not use this as a strategic and retaliatory measure, right?
Absolutely. So we just need enough to make sure that it's not a threat anymore, right? So even if China does threaten us, we have enough for our critical industries and strategic industries that we can keep it running, even if China threatens us in the future that we'll cut off your supply to rare earths. Otherwise, it is all well and good if we buy cheap rare earths from China. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So we have a sector that's currently informal, largely through the Kabadiwala network and so on, and that needs policy intervention and incentives to sort of streamline, integrate, so that we can collect high value feedstock and then secondary process them to find all of these valuable things that are then useful in multiple industries as well as just for our strategic mineral resilience, right? But apart from that, I wanted to ask you, what are the other policy recommendations that must then be implemented?
So I think barring whatever I've already spoken about, reforming importing feedstock, two other things come to mind that we've mentioned in the paper, right? First is to do with the EPR rules. I think obviously we need to move past this four metal framework and include other critical minerals and rare earths, and we need to actively incentivize recycling of critical minerals and rare earths, right? Because it's a strategic perspective we need to look at and not only a commercial perspective. So I think the smartest way to do this, and what we have discussed in the paper, is applying a multiplier system to the credits, right? In the sense that, let's say, if you're recycling 1 ton of iron, you get one credit. But if you recycle 1 ton of rare earths, which is generally more difficult to do, you get 100 credits or 10 credits. The point being that you incentivize rare earth recycling, which is generally chemically harder to do and costs more, by giving people more credits for doing that. And therefore companies or the firms that are producing would actually ask their recyclers, hey, you focus on recycling rare earths, right? So this is one smart way to incentivize recycling. The other thing I think that is important is that We have Kabul, that is Khanji Bidesh Limited, to acquire assets and act as a vehicle for state funding for projects abroad. But the mandate for Kabul is exclusively outward facing, right? Kabul is focusing currently on missions in Australia and Chile. But I think we need a similar vehicle domestically. We need an instrument that can deploy funds within Indian industries. And so the name we came up for this is In Kabul, or Inward Facing Kabul. The purpose of this is not to provide grants or just to give out money. It is to act as a co-investor, right? The same thing that Kabul is doing outside. It is buying equity, or it is coming onto the consortium that is governing over some mines, etc., etc. So similarly, we need an inward-facing Kabul to deploy government funds strategically and act as a strategic co-investor, right? It should deploy capital where markets are not able to, like this sector, like rare earth recycling specifically, because of high capex and high price volatility. So I think those are the two things I would like to talk about mainly in
Yeah.
terms of recommendations.
Yeah, I think the other that may be important is for the Indian government to set some kind of procurement guarantees. Because I think one of the bigger challenges here is that primary production coming out of China can sometimes be cheaper than recycled products and minerals globally, just because of subsidies and Chinese financial repression and subsidies, right? So what that then means is, for example, what we saw with lithium prices last year, which were really pretty cheap, right? Like the prices had crashed, and we saw how Chinese overcapacity and ability to turn the dial in terms of whether they want to restrict or oversupply in the global market can then have ripple effects for the ability of other companies to themselves, be able to stand up, or even for other countries to develop integrated mine to magnet value chains. So I think for the Indian government to set offtake guarantees at prices that may be slightly above market price, or at least guaranteed to be balanced from the Chinese prices, could be quite helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, this would never be dead stock, right? We, anyways, would want to set up a stockpile for some critical minerals. And this is another thing that the NCMM has previously stated as part of their, things that they would need to do. So I think whatever they acquire at above market price could go to a stockpile under NCMM.
Correct. I think in that respect, the union budget, not mentioning recycling at all, sort of becomes something of a glaring gap, in the sense that they mention something about rare earth corridors in a few coastal states, but didn't mention recycling. And this is particularly glaring because the National Critical Mineral Mission has a 1,500 crore outlay focused on recycling, of course, for a 7-year period. But we see little progress, at least in terms of formalizing the sector. And I think that can change.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Tannmay. I think this was an interesting talk, and this is definitely a thought-provoking paper in terms of discussing what can be done immediately from what we have, while undercutting Chinese processing capabilities and being able to have some level of dependence from China weaned off. So, to that, thank you for this paper and thank you for this podcast.
Thank you.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.